Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of EOXS's Stories on Steel. This is a steel industry podcast featuring the big names of the business and the advice/stories they've accrued from their years as insiders. Steel has been a vital component in American life for well over a century, and the men and women who've helped it flourish are a diverse group of innovators full of interesting tales. We hope to share some of said tales with you today. Thanks again to EOXS for providing this platform. In addition to this show, they're bringing businesses online by providing a standardized digital workspace for all your steel-related needs. Today, we welcome the Vice President of Quality and Process Improvement at Eaton Steel Bar Company, David Verville. David, thank you so much for coming on the show today. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. It's an interesting topic in lieu of what's happening and just all the things that are going on in the world.
Well, before we get into the macro view of the industry currently as a whole, I think it's a good idea to give some of our uninitiated listeners a brief overview of what it's like working at Eaton Steel, what the company is like, your role. So expand on that if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. I've been with the company for 25 years. Prior to that, I worked in consulting for about 5 years, and Eaton was actually one of my clients, along with a number of other steel bar users within the industry, mostly companies that provided the auto industry, agriculture, big equipment, heavy truck. My role at the company has been varied over the many years. I've spent a good portion of time in quality, materials engineering. I spent about 7 years in the operations side. I was a plant manager for 5 years and was a vice president of operations for 2 years. And so have a pretty diverse background, pretty wide breadth of understanding of all the different systems. And so, yeah, I've seen a lot of changes over that 25 years within the industry in general.
Well, it's always great to be able to talk to someone with that kind of breadth of experience. Personal preference taken into account, was there a sector you enjoyed working in more than others, or did you generally have a similar experience all around?
Um, that's an interesting question. The two sectors that have the most stringent requirements oftentimes are the aerospace and the automotive companies. And so the automotive companies came out with standards for quality and for engineering that piggybacked off of the ISO standards many years ago, back in early 90s. And so it's been more difficult dealing with them because they have a lot more rigid requirements for initial submission of material to get approved and or additional ongoing requirements that they have in terms of how you respond to different matters and situations. And so our company supplies all of those different types of industries, but we also supply a large number of family-owned or privately held companies that tend to be a little bit more easygoing with regard to the day-to-day transactional issues.
Just for the sake of scale, what are the differences in demand from those smaller familial entities versus those big name buyers that you deal with?
Wow, great question. The footprint for our company is, without getting too overly specific with regard to our customer base, is our 10 largest customers are our hydraulic fittings customers. They're customers who are involved in the heavy truck. We've got one that's involved in the nuclear industry. Those companies account for something on the order of, I'm just doing the math in my head, maybe 35–40% of our business. The balance of it is actually a lot of small shops, a lot of shops that are less than 100 people. We belong to an association called the Precision Parts Machine Association, and most of its members are made up of individually owned, family-owned companies, and they are the heart and soul of the industry. and on the machining side at least. So you've got different segments based on the type of product we provide. So we provide predominantly steel bars and or tubing. So the application for our cold finish heat treat is might be one application. For the heat treat, it might go into the oil industry. On the other side, it may go into the cold finish. Will go into individual companies that will have typically CNC machines or screw machines, and where they're actually taking and machining off material. They're making nuts, bolts, shafts, things of that nature.
I would love to go more into the types of steel bars and what that product is like from your standpoint. But before I do, I'd just love to close on, you mentioned that you'd worked as a plant manager or plant overseer, was it? I don't want to make
Plant
sure I get
manager,
plant manager.
general manager. It goes by different titles, director of operations, however you want to define it.
All right. So is there a difference in how you deal with employees on the floor versus outside customers? Like, did you find any interesting, if you were to think about that, like the way you have to shift gears, does anything interesting pop out at you?
Um, I think that the biggest thing that comes to mind is, I, as a person and as a individual and having a value system that effectively looks at everybody as being very unique and having great potential and value. I try to respect everyone. I would say the difference, because we are a very customer-centric organization, is that with our customers, we will bend over backwards, if they've got claims. When you're a type of size that we are, about 400 people, you have to distinguish yourself with value and service. And so we will definitely go the extra mile and make accommodations for customers. An employee, although you treat them with respect, you provide some level of accommodation, but the heart of the matter is the customers pay your bills, you pay your employees. So that may seem hard, but it's sort of the crux of it.
Not to start off with too much humor, but I just got to imagine it's very stressful when you're dealing with clients like nuclear power, aerospace. Like something goes wrong on your end, components are like the material's faulty. You could be dealing with a lot of problems. Is there one that's more stressful than the other, or are you just a stone cold pro by this point?
No, I think you learn. I mean, we had a situation back a number of years ago, 10 years ago, where we had a shaft break on one of the on an automotive company's SUV, without alluding too much to who the company was and all that. I got a phone call on the day before the Super Bowl was in session, and so they effectively had garnered and quarantined thousands of vehicles in their yard because of their concern that this particular shaft was faulty and could snap or break. And so that definitely puts you in the triage business very quickly. You become very good at problem solving. You become very good at trying to understand the nature of it, and you move very, very quickly. So those kind of issues, we had a situation one time with a company that was producing agricultural equipment in which some gears were experiencing, when they went to heat them up, they were effectively, they had holes in them that were coming through. And the long story short was, it was a situation where somebody had melted steel, and prior to melting the steel that they were running at the steel mill, they had some remnants of leaded components still in what they would call the tundish, and that got mixed in, and lead melts at a much lower temperature than steel. And so that ended up being a $1 million plus claim. And so those type of situations are far and few between, um, but they do teach you very quickly that what you're dealing with is something that is very significant and could cause anything leading up to loss of life potentially.
Well, first of all, I want you to know that you're a much better man than me. The Saturday before the Super Bowl, I'm sinking my phone into a brick of lead and leaving it there until the day after, just because I don't want to be disturbed for the game. But also, I think that is such an incredible primal fear, because from a young age, you're taught like certain very big truths. And one is that like certain surfaces are hard and they're sturdy and you can rely on them, and steel is one of those without a doubt. You think of it, you think of stability, you think of structure, and the idea that those components could like be revealed to have been faultily welded and forged, or there was some error in the manufacturing. That's a very stressful thing that you have to deal with. So that's a very fascinating look that I don't think a lot of people think about.
You take lots of things for granted in your life. You know, it's like if you're driving a big vehicle or you're involved, you know, you just, and it's got a lot of metal around it, regardless of whether it's steel, aluminum, or whatever. You just feel like you're safe, you know, until obviously you come in contact with somebody of like kind.
Well, I think that this could be a really good opportunity for more people to learn about those processes, specifically with bar steel. So, for the layman out there, what are some of the differences in use for hot rolled versus cold finished steel, like the types provided by Eaton?
Yeah. So for a hot forged steel bar, that would be something in which oftentimes you would take and you sell into a market that would be like forgers, people who are effectively taking and heating it up again and then forming it into a component that might go into a larger um, assembly within a car vehicle. It could be something that typically you're making parts that don't have a requirement for the same level of surface finish. A cold finish bar has a much smoother surface. Anything cold finish can be cold drawn, turn and polish and grind. So you have a nice smooth finish. And so oftentimes, and you have a much straighter bar. So with those type of materials, they normally, their first operation is something in which somebody is taking and they're either threading, they're drilling, they're taking material off, they're sizing and resizing to create the type of parts that you would see with, you know, shafts, bolts, um, those, you know, you could see gears if they go through a splining operation, but normally cold finish material goes into applications where you have tighter tolerances. Hot roll goes into applications where the tolerances are not as stringent. You don't need to pay the extra money for the cold finishing of the material, because every time you cold finish the material, you have yield loss and you have other additional processing. Um, but the application doesn't demand the finer tolerances. If you have something that you have hot roll that is then, say, quench and tempered, oftentimes that goes into, especially the larger bar, goes into the oil and gas industry, where they take that and they actually use it to drill out on the platforms in the Gulf of Mexico. So um, just yeah.
Well, there's so like now I'm interested, just because there are so many differences that you need to have down. What was the learning process like on your end for like all this information, all these technical specs? Like, did it come easy to you?
Um, that's a great question, because I think so much of what you pick up over many years, you just kind of take for granted. If I have to look back, I think what I would say is that once when you work for a smaller, kind of a family-owned company rather than a large corporation, you learn the ins and outs of the business very quickly. So you learn who the customers are. And when you learn who the customers are, you typically make customer visits. And so, you go out to a forger, you go out to a CNC house, you go out to a company that is making big knuckle arms, for the underside of a truck, such as a TRW, which is now called THK. So you see the applications, you develop an understanding of how they're used, and then you effectively associate those, because when we as any material supplier, whether you're supplying steel or cloth or leather, you typically certify to industry standard requirements. They call them ASTM standard, American Society of Testing Materials. And then you've got the SAE, Society of Automotive and Engineering standards. So all of those standards have very specific requirements. And so when you piece together the application and what you also are required to certify to, you start to see the differences in terms of what differentiates one product versus another.
Do you, this might be reaching, but it sounds like it's a building of aha moments, like eurekas. You see the pieces fit together. Do any of those individual, like, oh, I understand now moments pop out in your memory?
It's interesting. I would say so. When we, this goes back probably about 15 years ago, the steel industry, in terms of how they make bars, they went from, for at one time, steel makers made big ingots, big slabs of steel, and then they would take that and remelt it and roll it. And in future iterations, when they got away from what they call basic oxygen furnace facilities, they went to electric furnace. They made smaller, a large steel quantity of a particular type of steel, which we call a grade, is called a heat. And so those quantities went from, say 300,000 pounds to some manufacturers now make 100 to 120,000 pound heat lot quantities. And the industry has evolved so as to be more and more efficient. So they have what they call continuous casting of steel. And continuous casting of steel means that rather than make an ingot or a balloon and then put it aside and then roll it later, reheat it and roll it, you continue on through. So you melt it, and then it automatically starts coming through what they call a strand caster, to where you narrow it down into a smaller size, and you go through a process where you are continually desizing it smaller and smaller and smaller to whatever it is that you are effectively looking for, and you make it either in bars or coils, and that becomes a more efficient process. The aha moment was, by doing that, you have a much smaller, what they call reduction ratio, which is you start with a particular size in terms of a bloom or a billet, and you roll it down into another size. That steel responds differently. So the way it's mixed, the way it's melted, and the applications that it has to meet will respond differently depending upon that overall desizing arrangement. And so when we went through the process of trying to identify whether or not we could run steel from a particular company who was making billets from the conventional blooms, we had to go through some sort of, we call it in the engineering world, design of experiments to make sure that we in fact produced it and were able to still get steel that wouldn't crack, that would machine properly for our end use customers, that had the same strength properties that we were trying to get. And so all of those things had to be evaluated on a great level. And so it was an aha moment, in a sense that, just because you have something that looks like steel, it's all in the way that it's processed. It's all in the way that it's melted. It's all in the way that you treat it in subsequent operations. And so, again, to the layman, it may seem like steel is steel, or aluminum is aluminum, or brass is brass, or whatever the case may be. But all of the ways in which you start the manufacturing to the end, in terms of the final use, determine a lot of different properties and ability to meet whatever the end use applications require.
I think a great real life example to that is, like you have an image in your mind of what a sword is, and it's easy to say all swords are created equal, but historically swords made by specific swordsmiths valued much higher than others because of, is it crucible steel? Like, can it bend? What's its breaking point? Like, there's differences in that process regarding where you're getting the steel, the process by which you get it. So I think that respect for the process, it's good to know that it's valued even today. Like, there are differences in the types of steel you're getting.
Well, of course, and you pay a price or a premium for certain requirements. And so if you've got even, I think the to your analogy, the sword, if someone's buying knives, you'll see the advertisements, this knife never needs sharpening, and that, it lasts for whatever, blah, blah, blah. You might have an infomercial where somebody takes it and slices,
or some guy comes to your front door and tries to sell you some. Yeah.
Something of that nature, and it's hard to judge because you don't really know what that steel grade is. You don't know what heat treatment it went through. Was it partially heat treated? Was it through hardened so that you got a greater level of consistency? All these things matter. So you're spot on. Yeah.
So, like, in that sense, would you mind telling us a little bit about the processes and the guarantees of quality that Eaton goes through when creating its product?
Great question. For us, we have adopted the automotive standards. So in the automotive standards, they put great emphasis on controlling the process, not the product. So if I'm trying to achieve certain physical properties, tensile, yield, hardness, all of these things are just things that you test for in a lab environment. But the way that you achieve that is, if you're doing, for example, heat treatment, is you control time and temperature, and the way that you quench material, or the way that you cool the material down. So the real control for any process to ensure a level of consistency on an ongoing basis is to control it as close to the process as possible. And without getting overly technical, the way we do that is we go through what we call a failure analysis. We look at how different products and applications can fail by process, and then based on the what we call a risk priority number, we go through a kind of a risk assessment. We identify what type of controls we need, and the controls for safety critical applications, we try to ensure at the process level as much as possible, so as to mitigate any issues in the field or at our customer or whatever. And so that's kind of the automotive, aerospace, but even it's being adopted within almost every industry where and most of your quality standards now talk at length about risk, risk assessment, mitigation of risk, whether it's process risk or whether it's business risk. That's really the essence of what constitutes a company that is looking at things in a holistic way.
Well, that's definitely really good to hear. And it's good to hear that the reaction to new standards seems to be, not just for your company, but for the industry at large, pretty adopted at a fairly quick pace. Do you foresee any newer standards being released anytime soon? At what rate do things normally get shaken up in that way, in your experience?
Most of most of the standards, it's like most of the standard bodies, such as ASTM. I'll just use that one as an example, or the ISO, the International Organization of Standards. Um, Most of those standards typically go through a pretty lengthy ballot and review process, and so you don't normally see anything in less than 3 years. Oftentimes, it's 5 years before they go through a significant revision. I think that what I would say is that the International Organization of Standards, they've come out with health and safety standards, which often is a way to protect your workers and to ensure that you meet the requirements for OSHA. I would envision that, depending upon how the election goes and all that, I would envision that a lot of your there are environmental standards. There's a environmental standard, ISO 14001, which defines a system for controlling your environmental aspects of your company in terms of how you treat everything from waste to really the oils, the fluids, everything that you use within the actual production. I would expect that those things would get greater visibility, especially with the COVID thing. I know that a lot of businesses with COVID have had to respond very quickly in terms of initiating controls. We check everybody with their temperature. We go through a questionnaire. We are very in terms of how we clean, masking, and a lot of that's driven because of the issues of liability. There's just if you don't respond favorably, you could be held liable. So I would envision those areas to be more active. The quality area is probably a little bit more of a mature area. The safety and environmental standards were adopted after kind of the shell was already put together for the quality side.
Just because it is for the foreseeable future, it is going to be impossible to avoid it as a topic of conversation. The pace at which different industries and companies in those industries reacted to the current pandemic, it varies very widely, I've noticed. Do you think Eaton jumped on certain standards appropriately, or was it a little too quick, too late? Do you think they hit that sweet spot in reacting in the right way at the right time?
Yeah, I would. My honest assessment is we responded very quickly. We've had very little exposure. We've had very few, if any, only a couple of situations, and we were considered an essential industry early on because of the companies we provide to. So even when the automotive companies were kind of shutting down, we were still producing, mind you, at a much lower volume, but we implemented the controls that were necessary based on what the CDC was recommending. And in some cases, we go above and beyond what is recommended to ensure the safety of our workforce. So without going into the business side and explaining everything, we have been doing a great job of picking up a lot of customers, not just because of the fact that we initiated great controls, but because we have a dedicated workforce. We were able to produce, we have inventory, and a lot of our competitors did not. And so our business right now is doing very, very well. We're meeting our targets, our goals, and I think, again, without being overly specific, we've done remarkably. If you look at a percentile ranking, we're in the top 10% easily with regard to how we've come out of this situation.
David, I have no problem with a man tooting his own horn, by the way. Feel free.
Wow.
But I think one of the last things I think I would love to cover is that within those parameters, within the limitations that the steel industry and every other industry has to live with, especially being one where hands-on contact and manufacturing is still massively important, like the cornerstone of the industry. Has the pandemic caused you to reevaluate or double down on any online presence Eaton has, like through social media, the website, outreach through emails, like that? That's where we're
That is a
communicating.
great question. And I know that the organization you represent has is really looking at the online presence within the steel industry. Um, there's two companies that are really doing it. They're trying to transfer a sort of culture that our industry is an old industry, and old industries have lots of individuals who have been in it for many, many years. I teach a class at Oakland University. I'm an adjunct professor. And so what I find is I survey the class, how many people want to go into manufacturing? You get very few hands that show up. So within the steel industry, it's not normally viewed as the first choice for many, many students. So the industry as a whole, because of the demographics being older and because of the mix of individuals who are working at it and even the companies, tends to be very slower to respond to sort of an online thought process. So for example, if we were to create, we at one time said we want to be the Amazon of the steel industry. That was one of the owner's comments. We want to be like Amazon. Well, no, we want people to buy stuff, and we want to be able to reference and say, your buying patterns show that you might be interested in this. And so the advanced shipment notices, the what we call paying electronically through electronic means, those kind of things have taken hold, but the actual online sort of view of looking up your inventory, selling online, having people go in and actually being able to check their order status, be able to track, even an order that might be getting processed through a particular line or series of processes. It's been slow in coming. There are a couple of companies, Big River and Glockner Metals, who have taken a very proactive approach in that area. But I would say that for the most part, the online presence is a little bit short. I'm working with our laboratory right now to try and kind of upgrade our web presence, social media presence, and it's been interesting because I took some classes in Google Analytics and for stuff that we're.
Sorry about that, folks. Brief technical difficulties. This is the problem with running a remote show. Sometimes forces of nature are beyond our control, but luckily David was, I think you were just talking about the social media side of things, and like it's not overwhelming presence.
It's a slower process for current steel companies. There are some companies that are more progressive, Big River, Glockner Metals, but for the most part, it's an older industry with the demographics of older individuals, and so a lot of people still like the physical connection. Zoom calls with customers and virtual calls for a lot of our customers don't cut it as much as a person-to-person call. So it is changing, and it will continue to change. Our owners definitely have always embraced technology and wanted to have the latest and greatest. If it was necessary, we would be moving even quicker than we are. And we'll probably be there a lot sooner than a lot of other people. But as a whole, the industry is still behind a lot of other industries.
Well, I don't think that's necessarily a detriment. Just it's a necessity issue. It hasn't needed to be where other industries are that are more reliant on that kind of customer interaction. But if we were to just chart out a course, say like 4 or 5 years from now, do you think that at that point we'll be seeing a noticeable uptick in the role social media and online interactions play in the steel industry?
I think, the social media piece works well for things like job recruiting, for connecting into different groups. There's a number of different steel industry groups on LinkedIn. So I think those things will have presence, and I think they have definite opportunity to kind of connect and relate and all that kind of stuff. But from my vantage point, I think the end game really is going to be something that is going to be kind of a hybrid between kind of an Amazon and just maybe to a lesser extent an Amazon approach. But people are trying to operate more and more on a lean basis, and so if they know that you have inventory, they're not going to carry inventory per se. So their desire to see stuff that you've made that's set aside for them. We're involved. We say one of our competencies is inventory management. So we'll make material. Inventory is not a bad word to us. We'll manage other people's inventory. So on an online presence, you'll see more people engaging, looking at what we have. Maybe there'll be an integration of their forecasts, their schedules, maybe even to the point of tying in our ERP or our materials resource planning systems in with their schedules. We'll just take that and effectively load it in on an electronic basis rather than going through the process of getting emails and getting people's forecasts or picking up the phone. And so those kind of transactional things, I think, will lead to greater efficiency. With AI, I think you'll see more of the analytics integrated in because people's customers oftentimes don't have a real good sense of what they're using and how often they need it. And it's kind of interesting. Sometimes we have a better sense of what they need and when they need it than they do. So those kind of real life issues will be incorporated into big data and into a greater online presence. Social media by itself, we've done little posts through Facebook. Facebook is really not the application. Instagram, obviously, TikTok, Twitter. These are just they're more for people on a personal level. There are, I think e-commerce, has some benefits of working through those kind of applications. But I think most of it is going to be a web presence and or a LinkedIn presence in terms of how I look at social media, at least.
I think that's a very fair and even-handed overview of the situation. I'm definitely, like yourself, interested to see what kind of pathways and dips it takes, like in the road towards the future. But as the timer informed us the last time we were in a Zoom meeting just a few moments ago, we are running out the clock a little bit. So I think this is a good place to call this episode of EOXS Steel Stories. David, thank you so much for joining us. It was an incredibly insightful conversation, and we would love to have you back again at some point.
I would. I love it. I love the fact that somebody's actually interested in the steel industry and manufacturing in general. We promote it, and we believe that for us to be successful as a country, we have to be successful on the whole manufacturing and steel side of the business. So, thank you.
I mean, when you think of the number of structures that are currently standing as part of iconic, skylines and backdrops, and just in the pathways we walk in and on top of every day, it's an incredibly important industry in the fabric of America. And I think getting a look at the behind the scenes and some of the more interesting stories of that industry is important. And I think EOXS is doing a great job in that regard. I'm definitely happy to have the opportunity to talk to folks like yourself, I definitely come away being reminded that I don't know as much about the world as I would like.
Nor do I. Thank you.
All right. Well, this has been, as I said, another insightful episode of EOXS's Stories on Steel. Thanks again to David for stopping by. And remember, whether galvanized or hot rolled, EOXS will provide a marketplace to take any steel business to the online sector. Thank you and good night.